tell you my fun fact, and then hopefully it will capture sound. I'm not sure. We'll see. Welcome to class on Parshat Bo. And my interesting trivia fact is that there are the same number of plagues in this week's Parsha as the gematria of the word bow. Right, so in gematria, Bet is 2 and Aleph is 1, so that's 3. And so it's like a neat way that my third grader taught me to remember that 7 plagues have already happened when we enter Parshat Bo, because there are 3 left, just like the gematria of the word bow. So one of those 3 plagues is the plague of darkness. And I don't think that I was aware of this growing up, either because I was just like a happy-go-lucky kid, or because Boston truly is much sunnier in the winter than Michigan is. But I've really been thinking about sort of like the grayness of this time period that we read Parshat Bo during, and the sort of dark feelings. And when I first taught this particular shiur, I taught it at the inauguration of President Biden. I in no way have any political agenda here or then, but I think that there was like a feeling that there was just like a heavy darkness for those who were, Democrats or not Trump supporters or not insurrection supporters at that time, and so it felt sort of appropriate then as well. We're not in inauguration season this time of year this year, but it always is inauguration season when we read Parshat Bo. So I wanted to look at the plague of darkness in particular, and think a little bit about like darkness and light and how those things interact and what it means to say there was a plague of darkness on the land. So let me share my screen here. And as I said, I started and ended this year with Amanda Gorman because I wrote it right after the inauguration of President Biden. Amanda Gorman was a poet laureate who spoke at the graduation, and I really think that she wrote a commentary on this week's Parsha, whether she intended to or not. And so just this one little bit to get us started to frame our learning is that she said, when day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? And I think that there might have been a feeling of that sort of question within the Parsha. And it's also, I think, the kind of question that the Meforshim glom onto in our Parsha. So I'm going to scroll down here. So let's think first about, like, let's get our bearings in the Parsha. So in Shmot, a little typo there, in the 10th parak, we are introduced to the plague of darkness. And so as it follows sort of the script of plagues, right, first God says something to Moshe, and what he says is, Neteh yadcha al hashamayim, v'yehi choshech al eretz Mitzrayim. And so he says, Moshe, stretch your hand out towards the heaven that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt. And then the last 2 words are particularly interesting, vayamesh choshech, even darkness which may be felt, which, right, will allow the Meforshim to say there's something really special about this darkness. It's not the regular darkness of like night versus daytime. And so Moshe does that. Vayet Moshe yado al hashamayim v'yehi choshech afela b'chol aretz Mitzrayim shloshet yamim. And there was a thick darkness. Choshech afela is thick, a thickness, sort of maybe that feeling of darkness, or maybe just a deep, deep darkness. I'm thinking about the time of month that we're in. No, we're not in it would be interesting if we were in a new moon when you read Shmot, because that's right, that's the darkest it can be outside without natural light, because the moon is at its smallest, but that's not true here. Lo ra'u ish et achiv v'lo kamu ish mitachtav shloshet yamim v'chol b'nei Yisrael haya or b'moshe votam. And so in this pasuk we have 2 new interesting ideas that we're going to play with. One is that when they're talking about the Mitzrayim, presumably, although it doesn't say Lo Ra'u Ish Mitzri es Achiv, but they saw not one another, and neither rose from any from his place for 3 days. Right. So the darkness, this thickness, might be sort of physically oppressive in some way, according to the text, but it also is so dark that you can't see another person. But the text tells us that actually Bnei Israel still had light, right? Some of the plagues were such that they affected Bnei Israel and the Mitzrayim sort of equally, maybe unfortunately because of like the way that the plague works, right? If it was like a plague of animal affliction or pestilence or barad, it didn't, for whatever, there was no passing over, so to speak, right, of the space. But here we see that actually the darkness skips the Jewish neighborhood, so to speak. Okay, so the first person that I want us to look at is Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. He wrote beautiful commentaries to the Parsha. This is from his book on Shemot. There's like a 5-book series, which is beautiful of essays. And this is from his essay called Heart of Darkness. It's on page 75 of the book. And he's talking about a much bigger idea. And it's a long passage, so I couldn't bring the whole thing. But the important thing here is that Rabbi Sachs is saying, what is a yamesh choshech or a choshech afela? There's something spiritual about it. It's not only an optical experience, right? So he says the plague of darkness was not a mofet, but an ot, a sign, right? We say that God did otot umoftim for us, and he's making a distinction that this is a sign. So what is it signaling, right? What do signs show us? The obliteration of the sun signals that there is a power greater than Ra, right? Ra is the sun god that the Egyptians worship. Yet what the plague represented was less the power of God over the sun, but the rejection by God of a civilization that turned one man, Paro, into an absolute ruler, son of the sun god, with the ability to enslave other human beings, and of a culture that could tolerate the murder of children, because that is what Ra himself did, right? By Paro, people to throw the boy children into the Nile. Yeah, Kathy, go ahead.
Can you tell me what is a mofet? I don't know that.
So it's like the English translation is a wonder usually, right? God performs signs and wonders for us.
So the shoresh
so
is ofe, or what's the shoresh for that?
Nen pei tet. Tuf is my guess. I don't know that word.
No, the
wonder.
mem is probably just the beginning.
The gerund kind of thing, right? Or that's not the right word.
I think so.
Surprised. It's probably the same root as surprised.
Ofet? What would it be?
So it'd be mem, fe. I don't know whether it's aleph or hey.
Okay.
Oh, mofa. Yeah, probably. It's probably an aleph is my guess, but yeah, so I'm not sure exactly what the structure is. I can look for it. But generally we say, right, God performs otot umoftim, so like the plural of ot and mofet, and they're translated as signs and wonders.
Signs and wonders. Oh, yeah, I see.
And so what Rabbi Sachs is saying is, I'm sad that we didn't meet last week, but what I wanted to talk about last week was thinking about how this is like almost like the meeting point for God and this iteration of the Jewish people, right? They had felt forgotten for 200 years, and that part of the reason for all the plagues was to strengthen God's relationship, and it was like about first impressions, right? So God was showing I think the Moktim were meant to like impress Bnei Israel.
Yeah.
It was doing a trick, when you meet someone, or to say, look, I am powerful, you can trust in me, you can believe in me. And Rabbi Sachs is saying, so what was the role of the otot, the signs? The signs were like more of a values communication, and the moftim, the value was to show off the strength and power of the God that was asking them to give up everything and leave town, basically.
Yeah, the wonders that's a pretty good concept. Thanks.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to split the two. So had we met last week, we would have talked more about the wonders. but we didn't because of my poor schedule and the overall health of my family. But the otot, the signs are, I think, more interesting. You know, and I was thinking about you yesterday, Kathy, because I taught someone else the sheep last year on Parshat, but we talked about the sheep and how we kept them in our homes for 4 days prior to slaughtering them. And I remember learning that with you last year. And I was thinking that that's also a values communication, right? That we were saying that killing the sheep was saying, like, we don't believe in the Egyptian gods. And so it's interesting that sort of this might foreshadow that a bit, to say killing the light, right? Hitting the light is saying we don't believe in those Egyptian gods either, right? It's God sort of saying it first, and then God asks us to say it with the sheep, is maybe how I was thinking about it while I was preparing. And to think, right, that it's not just about idol worship, right? Because I think, right, I don't particularly like to think of God as like a jealous God. It's not that God doesn't want us to worship Ra for no reason, but because this culture that built up the God of the sun and then the son of the sun God allowed it to be a culture where there was absolute authority, and it was a God that was very unkind, right? A God that had no morality, right? And in fact, that's, I think, sort of the punchline of Rabbi Sachs's article, is that the 9th plague was a divine act of communication that said there is not only physical darkness, but also moral darkness, right? And in that way, we might be able to understand a little bit of why Bnei Israel had light, right? If we're saying that for many, or hopefully most of Bnei Israel, they were able to sort of retain their moral compass through this period of enslavement, they didn't. That's sort of a description, right? The text is saying the Egyptians and maybe some of the Jews, right? There's a strong midrashic explanation that the Jews who believed in the Egyptian gods got lost in the darkness, and they didn't come out with Bnei Israel. And so those who are in the darkness are those who have lost their moral compass. But Bnei Israel, those who have not lost their moral compass, they have light in their dwellings. And so darkness becomes about much more than the darkness, which I like. It is definitely like sort of in the realm of midrash, in the sense that there's nothing, shot-like about this explanation, because I don't think that's right. None of the other plagues have been descriptive of the Egyptian people in quite this way. And it's a very personal attack of God on the Egyptian people, which I think I like. It like feels very targeted as opposed to just like generally cruel. There's some kind of divine act of communication that's going on. It's more than just making it so that people can't see anything. But that's one perspective of sort of a moral darkness that is guided by a culture of sun god worship, and that sun god is not a just God. This other commentary, which was new to me, the Parparaot La Torah, I could find some references to it, but I could not find a Hebrew copy at the time I made this. But this Rebbe Hanoch of Alexander, he's a 19th century Hasidic Rebbe, so a little Chassidut to maybe complement the Rabbi Sachs, is that he says, what kind of moral darkness was it, right? He sort of agrees with Rabbi Sachs, I think, in principle. And this is the English translation that I'm trusting is right, because I unfortunately could not find the Hebrew. But he says, what does it mean that people could not see one another, right? He's catching on to the description of the darkness. Lo ra'u ish et achiv. People could not see one another. And he says that is to say that each individual only worried about themselves and only looked to save themselves and the members of their household, and thus did not rise from under the darkness for 3 days. Not a single one of them succeeded in rising above the degraded spiritual level that they were caught in. So I love that, right? Like that the answer to their problem was actually within them. That feels like almost like a fairy tale that I read my kids at night, right? That all they had to do was look inside, right? Sort of like Dorothy, right? How did she get home? She didn't have to do all that crazy adventuring. The Egyptians didn't have to wait for God to lift this plague. They could have lifted it themselves. I think that's a really cool idea. the Egyptians were responsible for their own darkness. And this also, I think a lot of the plagues feel like Paro brings them down upon everyone, right? It's sort of like a despotic culture in that way. But this one seems to be earned because of their selfishness and self-centeredness. It was not the symptom of darkness, it was the cause. Their darkness was spiritual. So again, Reb Chanoch is saying, like, this is not like dam, right, blood, or Tzfardea, the frogs, where it's a plague. The experience is the plague. There's something different about the darkness. It's either some kind of divine communication that their behavior is not tolerated, or it happens because, right, they put themselves in their own darkness by being self-centered. And there is also, in the Midrash, there are ideas that, like, the Jews could, right, and this is actually not, it's not something I would say fits terribly well with me, but this idea that the Jews might have gone to pillage the Egyptian homes during Parshat, that it was partially like a cover that God was providing so that we could come out for Refush Gadol with lots of spoils of war, right? So there's a question when we get there, well, how did they get the spoils of war? When did they do this ransacking? And the answer is during the Choshech, that wherever a Jew went, their cone of light stayed over them. And the Jew my phone. Can you hear me now? Let's see, let's get on something different to play with. Can't play with my phone when I'm using it. So I was saying that the Egyptians were ransacked or pillaged by the Jews during the plague of Choshech, because the Jews had like a pillar of light over their head, like that sort of just like the cone of light, and they could see wherever they went, but the Egyptians couldn't see. And so when we say that the Jews went out for Rechush Gadol, with lots of the spoils of war, the question is, when did they get them? Oh, they got them during Choshech, when they could be like really sneaky. So I don't know if you heard it, and hopefully it's on the record, that I don't think that's such a comfortable thing to say that we did at that moment. I can see Kathy feels uncomfortable too, but that there's a reason that it doesn't touch the Jews, and there's a reason that it touches the Egyptians. So that's like the Egypt-centered maybe piece of this puzzle for me. But there's also another way of thinking about it, because I think, right, so far, what can we do after reading the Parparos, La Torah, and Rabbi Sachs, is we can pat ourselves on the back. Good job, Bnei Israel lived in the light, right? We were in the light. We don't have to worry about this. We're not self-centered. We're not degraded spiritually, right? We're okay. We can rise above over these 3 days, right? But it happened again that during this inauguration year, I think it was maybe 3 years ago, was right at the beginning of the Daf Yomi cycle. I had just started learning Daf Yomi, and in Brachot, there's this interesting idea where they're talking, right, the beginning parak of Brachot is talking about when you say the Shema. And here, they're discussing when it's light enough to say Shema in the morning. And Achirim, who is a person or maybe people, say, Misha yir'eh et chavero rachok arba amot v'yakirenu. When is it light? It's when you can see a friend from a distance of 4 cubits and recognize him. And they are definitely talking about light and being able to see your friends, like, and being able to see, like, oh, I see that's Elizabeth, squinting into the 4 amot, the 4 cubit between you two. But I was thinking, like, if this were a commentary on this pasuk, right, and on the idea of Reb Chanoch that people could not see one another. So when can we daven? It's when we can look at each other and recognize one another, right? When we're not self-centered, when we can look out, when we can look beyond ourselves, and that davening before then, sort of like, without minyan, not in like the sense of 10 men exactly, but like without community, without being able to see one another from a distance and also recognize each other, we've, lost something there, maybe. And so I think that if you, and this is a stretch, and this is all Rabbi Yael, so take it or leave it for what you like it, but, I think if you read this little tiny snippet of Brachot in relation to this pasuk about the Egyptians not seeing each other, it could also serve as a reminder to the Jewish people that the value is in seeing each other, that the plague was not the darkness and the oppressive physicality of the darkness, but the plague was that what happens when you forget to see one another. And that we dive in when we can see each other, when we can relate to each other, when we recognize one another. And that's like the powerful piece. Okay, I want to go one more place, unless people have things they want to say now. So Reb Nachman, who is also a Hasidic great Gadol, he talks about this from a like an emotional, psychological perspective. Again, focusing on what we can learn from it as opposed to what we can learn about how bad the Egyptians were from it. Because, I think that there's like a lot of interesting oath right there, like communication and thinking about what it means, what God was obliterating. But I think that this is making it relatable to ourselves is sometimes more helpful or more pertinent. So Rav Nachman says that the evil inclination, the Yetzer Hara, is more interested in the depression following a sin than in the act of sinning itself. For nothing is as spiritually and even physically debilitating as depression, right? So, maybe there should have been a trigger warning here, right? But so anyone who has suffered from depression before, right, knows that it is a choshech afela, right? I think that's maybe what I like about this commentary is that it's a physical, oppressive darkness. It makes it so you can't get out of bed. It makes it so you can't, get to shul, so you can't see people outside of work. Like it really it weighs you down. And this idea that the depression is worse than the sin, right? It also, I think, ties into that idea of the Egyptians like bringing the darkness upon themselves. That the darkness is the consequence. It's not the act. It's what happens when you sin. It's what happens when you can't see each other, right? It's what happens when you worship a sun god that prioritizes killing small children. Whatever that sin is, but it's much more relevant to us than to a culture that's gone. So then the exodus from Egypt, nationally and personally, entails confronting the darkness and returning to the light. They held on to the light and hope of salvation. Just as the plague of darkness immediately preceded the redemption from Egypt, so too the darkest hour comes right before the dawn. Knowing this secret and deciding never to give up are the greatest antidotes against the evil inclination's ultimate secret weapon of suppression. So I think Reb Nachman says a lot of really powerful things here. One is that even if Bnei Israel technically could see, right, that there was light in their places, that this was a dark time, right? That it was that sometimes we see a change, like a tidal wave coming, and we can feel hope even at a bad time. But Reb Nachman is saying at this time where we might be expecting that the Jews felt light, they might have felt darkness because the darkest hour comes right before the dawn, right? And again, tying into the Kriyat Shema conversation above, right? It's that when you come out, when can you say Shema? Right when you come out of the darkest hour, right when it's gotten light enough that you can see the person in front of you. And that knowing this secret, right, this is very Reb Nachman language to sort of let us in on a secret of the world, is that if you feel like it is the darkest it's ever felt, it means it's almost done. It doesn't mean that you're only halfway. It doesn't mean you're at the worst part. It means you're almost at the best part. You're almost at the redemption, the light, the salvation, whatever the thing is. And that this is how we fight our Yetzer Hara, is that when we're in our own Egypt, right? Mitzrayim is about being in a narrow place. We talked about this on Rosh Chodesh. And freedom is about being liberated, about freeing oneself from that narrowness, whether it's like a mental narrowness, right? The narrowness that depression causes, whether it's a physical sort of tightness, and that if we can fight against that Yetzer Hara, then we can get to this place of openness and expanse and lightness. So I think that, those are three sort of different ways of thinking about this, but all of them, right, none of them, unlike the blood or the frogs, things that feel sort of extraordinary, hail, whatever, there's no attempt by any of these specific commentaries to say, oh, well, it's really an actual darkness, and there was an eclipse and a solar eclipse that year, and it was like Alaska in the wintertime, right? There are ways to say that it was dark all the time, but there is something much stronger here at play, because I think that the metaphor of darkness is just a really powerful metaphor. And so I was really quite taken. I wish we could read all of Amanda Gorman's poem out loud, but I just put this very little piece here because I really, again, I do think that like she touches on a lot of these ideas, right? So this is the first part that I read above, and then she says that we've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. And yet the dawn is hours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. I think that is a gorgeous explanation of B'nai Israel, a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished, right? We have a lot of work to do in the Midbar. Maybe God even knew that, right? You could argue that we get sent on our 40-year journey because God knew that we had a lot of work to do in the Midbar, but whatever it is, we have a lot of growing to do before we get to the promised land, to Israel. But we aren't broken, right? And maybe that ties into the Reb Nachman piece, that it's not, we know that we're at that dark before the dawn, but we know that we can climb out of it. And so she says, when day comes, right? And if we think about this as like Choshech ending, right? Choshech is plague number 9, 8, 2. 10 is Nakat B'chorot. I think Choshech was 9. Right, it is very close to the end, right? That's the other interesting thing, like Reb Nachman, right? It's very close to the end. So when day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it, for there is always light if we're only brave enough to see it, if we're only brave enough to be it, right? And I would say she almost inverts this midrash about the poor, deceitful, moral, immoral act of B'nai Israel pillaging, right? But if you take this idea, right, if there is always light, if we're only brave enough to see it, if we're only brave enough to be it, and come back up here to the pasuk, right? What does it mean that there was light for B'nai Israel? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe we experience. I see 5. 1 second. Yeah, go ahead. Right, what does it mean to be such a good place in my thought process? Right, what does it mean that B'nai Israel has light? Maybe it doesn't. Maybe there was darkness throughout the land, but for B'nai Israel there was light because there's always light if we're brave enough to see it, right? And so the light, if we want to say that it was actually light and the Choshech is like a moral darkness or a spiritual darkness, maybe we could flip that on its head and say, actually, it was dark. There was a plague of darkness, and the plague pretty much affected everybody at the same time. So what does it mean? It means that there was moral light, right? There was darkness throughout the land, but the Jews had a moral light to them, and they were able to bring that with them when they went places. And then they wouldn't be pillaging, right? That's not like the conclusion of the Midrash any longer. It would be that, maybe it was the time where they went and they checked on the older slaves or the slaves who were sick or the, ones who were about to give birth because they were able to see the light during this darkness. So, Amanda Gorman is not a traditional commentary on the Parsha, nor was she attempting to be, but I thought that it, I was quite taken with her way with words, and it seems that it fit in very well with the Parsha. So I think whether we think about darkness as physical or metaphorical, and whether we think about it as like the darkness coming over or the light peeking out from under, I think for us to take out of this Makat Choshech as we prepare to leave Egypt, this is an interesting point. It happens very fast in Shemot, the turning point, right, from slavery to people building. And I'm very interested in thinking about like what kind of B'nai Israel leaves Egypt, and then what kind of B'nai Israel forms in the desert, because the brave people who left Egypt quickly become the whiny people who need, quail or watermelon or whatever the things that they had in Egypt. And the people for whom there was always light quickly become people who need a pillar of light from God to follow them. And so I think there's something beautiful about this moment of maybe independence, of being able to find the light and the way out of the darkness here, and that, you know, we should see if we can hold on to it and find it in the midbar as well. But that's what I've got here. Meet your eye. I need 2 more minutes. I'm not talking to you about candy right now. Okay. I would love to hear if anyone has ideas or thoughts.
Well, I really like your drashas, because it always makes me think not just about what you're talking about, but things that are happening currently in my life. And what you were saying made me remember what I think is a beautiful conversation I had with my mother Tuesday night. She's 96. And she's in great mental shape and everything, except she has macular degeneration. So she was saying, so that means that her central vision, she can't recognize people's faces, which is, of course, really troubling to someone who's cares about other people and is social. And she said to me, but you know, I live in a small town where I've lived my whole life. I can tell just by the way a person moves or walks, or if I listen to their voice, or I know where it is that I often can find them. She said, I can really fool people into thinking that I see them. And, you know, I was just thinking about, you know, being brave enough to be the light, because, you know, when we shut down one of our senses, we have other ones, you know, to relate to the world and each other. And anyway, I just thought it was a beautiful thing she said, you know, and I really admired her for that. Yeah.
That is really, and very brave, right? Talking about bravery, it's hard to be that way.
Yeah. And she's trying not to let it limit her relationship with other people and you know,
in the chat that you want to say something.
Am I heard?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you.
Things are always the same. Now, excuse me, 20%, I believe, of the Jews left Egypt and decided to abandon the rest of the community. And this seems to have a parallel with today's Jewish population, which is being assimilated into the general population, as it was, I believe, in Egypt. The fact that the Jews could borrow, in quotes, things from their neighbors indicates that maybe not all the Jews had experienced the slavery of other Jews, because they were more privileged and lived in a better condition.
Yeah. I think it's a great point. I think it was just last year when I was 38 years old that I turned to my cousin at the Seder and I said, well, if we believe we're descended of the people who left Egypt, what we're saying is we believe we are like the cream of the Jewish crop, right? Our ancestors were the ones brave enough to leave. The ones who stayed behind, we don't know those people anymore, right?
Right.
There's like a sort of a flip of thinking about it then, right? That those people who were more privileged, right, who could live near their Egyptian neighbors, who knew the layout of their homes, whatever we want to say, those people are forgotten. They don't have descendants celebrating Pesach today. It's the ones who were not in that position that are the ones who, you know, brought us out of Egypt, who gave us such a long legacy. So it's really interesting to think about the infighting or the sort of maybe the tensions between the Jewish people in Egypt, because I agree with you. I do not think they voted en bloc, and they did not behave that way. They did not all, you know, we think about it as very simple. Egyptians were bad, Jews were good. And there's like probably a big mush in the middle of righteous Gentiles, like if we're thinking about language to borrow from another tragedy, and also Jews who we know chose not to come.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
I
think it's
yeah.
I think it's a wonderful thing to think about every day. When you get up in the morning, you think, my goodness, I'm lucky I'm here another day and I have another chance. And you're coming out of night where you can't do anything. But now you have another chance. It's another new day.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I think in the darkness, we let our anxieties consume us, right? The list of things we have to do or the people we're worried about. And when you wake up, if you can have a different perspective, the light gives you a changed and empowered perspective. It's beautiful.
Sure.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of nice, one of the things I like about what you said about your mom, Kathy, is right. Like when people say, but do you really see me, right? You see me, but do you really see who I am? Right? So your mom might not be able to really see the person anymore, but she really sees them, right? And so I think it's the same, like when we thank God for our neshama in the morning, right? With Moda Ani, it's basically about returning our soul to us. In the darkness, we feel like our soul has gone away. And so then how much more powerful is it to start the day again, reunited with one's soul, right? Or the feeling of autonomy over one's soul, to what degree we have autonomy in our lives. Is a beautiful idea. And then how powerful is this? Like at first you think, oh, I'm just outside of like the PICO zone, right? That's what it's called here, PICO? The power company? What's it called here? Maybe it's not called that here. Right, the energy zone, right? I'm in the blackout or I'm not in the blackout. This is actually saying I have that license to have autonomy, right? To go about my day, to do new things, or I have the ability to really be sort of spiritually or mentally or, communally attuned to say, I really see you. It's a very powerful little piece of our pasuk then, because it means so much more than just being able to see,
Right.
like what's beautiful.
Okay.
Yeah, I was reading it, thinking about it this year, like, I really do think this is the most powerful plague. There are other terrible plagues and like gross plagues, right? And Makat Bechorot maybe belongs like in its own category because again, even with the sort of karma of losing children after Paro commanded that we lose children, that feels like a very hard thing. But thinking about lice or boils or those are terrible afflictions, but this really feels like there's so much more behind it. I think it's a beautiful plague, as it were. It's a beautiful mofet, right? It's a beautiful wonder.
Yes.
Or oath,
Yeah.
as the case may be here.
Right. When you think about the people in the Holocaust who kept their faith and came from their dark days to live, with lots of light and a whole different way of life. It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Yeah.
Definitely. And those stories, right? People talk about it that way, right? Moving from darkness to light, being able to step back into the light. I think you're right. And those are moments of like the Reb Nachman, right? True national pitch blackness, right? That true debilitating darkness. But at the end of the day, we get that choice when we're lucky, right? Sometimes, God forbid, people perish in all kinds of ways. But if we can find that choice and utilize it, I think Reb Nachman is saying it's there. If you can find it, it's there for you. And that when it's really dark, the light is coming.
Right.
So I hope that in this darker period of the year, that we can be the light and we can see the light and we can feel the sun, no matter how far away it might feel today. And I did want to mention that there are not this Shabbat or even the next one, but in 2 weeks there's a jam-packed weekend We have a scholar, Jewish scholar, film director here, Rafi Balulu, and he is screening his film on Rabbi David Buzaglo, who is a Sephardi liturgical poet. It will be at Hillel at 7:30 on Saturday night, February 4th. And he will answer questions afterwards. He's a Sephardi Jew, and he has a really super interesting perspective on the Sephardi immigration to Israel and Israeli culture in terms of like being a relative minority group within the society at that time. So highly recommended. And then on February 5th, which is Sunday, it is Erev Tu B'Shvat, and so at 8 o'clock at night there will be a seder. It will be at Jenny Lewis and Mark Bernstein's home at 8 p.m. And I think it will be really wonderful with Torah and singing and new fruits and wine and all those good things. So 2 in-person events at the very beginning of February. So I hope you'll save the date. And oh boy, I hope everyone has a smoother week than I am having here.